gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be talking yet more about the Orbis versus Durango. What a difference a week makes. It wasn't too long ago that I released a video that goes into depth of just what each console is going to bring, and a comparison of sorts between them. However, as you know, just a small amount of time actually in the computer game industry can make a huge difference, and now we have a lot more details on the specifications of both machines, okay? So we can get kind of more of an understanding of just what each system is going to be running into. Now, before I jump into this in its entirety, bear in mind that this is extremely technical stuff in some instances, and if you want to know more about this, in other words, what some of the stuff means, look out for a future video, because I'm going to be explaining more of it. But for this particular video, it's going to be focused on versus one another, okay? And the Wii U is probably not really going to be getting a look in here, as I've done another video on the Wii U, and that one, well, you can see that yourself of just how the Wii U stacks up versus the old specifications. Not really much is going to have changed, okay? Okay, so let's just get on with this. Now, we've known for a while that the CPUs of both machines is going to be extremely similar. It's going to be an 8-core AMD offering, and that CPU is going to be running at 1.6 gigahertz. Now, that might sound a little bit low, but they're extremely efficient CPUs. We'll get into that in a second. Basically, they're the new range of CPUs from AMD, and they are named Jaguar. Now, this is extremely important because the Jaguar CPUs are for low-end, low power devices. This would be something like, say, laptops, or let's say tablets, that type of thing. Now, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to give a very brief overview of the CPU. Now, they're pretty much exactly the same. Now, bear in mind that this is rumors. These are rumors. These are not confirmed. This is not from Microsoft. This is not from Sony. So if we turn out that this is a 4-core CPU and that's it, and it's running at 200 megahertz, that's not my fault. I'm just saying, because I don't want to be like, hey, you told me this. I'm just saying what the rumors currently say, okay? Right, now I've covered by an ass. It's a 64-bit architecture, which isn't surprising, considering both consoles are going to be pushing quite a lot of RAM. Obviously, the 32-bit architecture has a limit on how much memory. I'm not going to bother to go into that too much, however. Now, I've mentioned before that this is going to be 8 CPU cores. Now, these cores are split, if I can spit the word out, into 2 clusters. Now, the 2 clusters obviously contain 4 cores each, okay? Now, each of those cores can handle 1 thread, and that's it. So there's no hyper-threading involved on this particular thing. And each module of those CPU cores, so each cluster of 4, if you will, has 2 megabytes of a level 2 cache. This means you've got 4 megabytes total of level 2 cache. Now, each of those threads basically has 32 megabytes or 32 kilobytes of level 1 instruction cache, with an additional 32 KB of level 1 data cache. Now, according to the Orbis specs, and I'm assuming Durango would be pretty similar, we're going to be looking at around 102.4 gigaflops of data for the entire system, in other words, how much it can calculate, as well as things such as SSE up to SSE4. Now, SSE, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is basically an instruction set, and if you were to download an application such as, say, CPU, any CPU basic identification system, you could see that there's a good chance that your CPU is going to probably have that as well, especially if it's a modern one. Now, in terms of memory, and we're going to jump into that before we go into the graphics core or anything like that, memory has been a very hotly debated topic from the Orbis' perspective. This was sparked from rumors just a while back, actually, by a few people that have said that the developers kit of the Orbis had 8 gigabytes of RAM, and Sony themselves were pushing for 8 gigs in the finished system. Now, bear in mind, once again, that these are not finalized specs. However, right now, the Xbox 720 and the Orbis are tackling a RAM extraordinarily different. Now the Orbis has a lot more memory bandwidth, however it's got less RAM. I'll go into this right now. The Orbis has 4 gigs of RAM. Now only 3.5 gigabytes of that is available for the games. This is an estimate, this is not a fact. But that memory, that 3.5 gigabytes for the games anyway, 4 gigabytes total as I've said, is going to have 176 gigabytes of memory bandwidth. This is GDDR5 RAM, okay? That RAM is typically reserved for what you'd expect on, say, a high-end graphics card, okay? If you were to go to, say, Amazon or whatever, and you were to look at the more expensive graphics cards there, say, the GTX 680 and the high-end ATIs, or AMDs now, you'd see exactly the same type of RAM. It's basically there to kick ass in terms of the bandwidth. It's very fast memory. Now, the Orbis goes for a united approach, however, well, Durango does things a little bit differently. It's going for sheer amount. It's going for, well, beating the other system over the head. It's got 8 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. Notice I said DDR3, which means it's got significantly less bandwidth. It's just under 70 gigabytes, like 68 GB. It's also got 32 megabytes of fast embedded SRAM, also known as ESRAM. That sucker runs at 102 gigabytes. Now, from the perspective of the CPU, this means it's got 170 gigabytes of peak bandwidth to worry about. It's got that amount, which is pretty darn impressive. So what the absolute hell is going on with this? Okay, I'm going to give you a breakdown real quick. The idea is that, at least from what the rumors say, that the Durango is supposedly not just a games machine. And some of this memory, in other words, some of this RAM, is not just for games. It's actually for other things. The purpose is so that you can run other things simultaneously, such as various apps and media and everything else, while you're doing gameplay. So in other words, while you're playing a game, you can do something else, and it's fine, it's happy, and it doesn't impact your gaming experience, right? That's cool. Now, one of the advantages actually from the Xbox 360 over the PS3, so obviously we're going back a little bit here, is actually the memory architecture, ironically enough. Now, the difference from the Xbox 360 over PS3 was the memory. Now, there's 512 megabytes on both consoles, but it was split up extraordinarily different. The Xbox 360 had 512 that was unified. In other words, it could be accessed however it wanted. Now, this memory was a GDDR3, so exactly the same memory, actually. I'm not saying it's the same bandwidth, however, as the... well, it's a successor. Now, the PS3 is different. It does not have unified memory. It has the same total amount of RAM, but 256 was reserved for system and 256 was reserved for graphics. This meant that in some applications, in some games in particular, Sony's machine was noticeably inferior. Now, the problem here was with putting 8 gigs of GDDR5 into a system. In other words, what the Xbox 720 wants to do, in other words, with the 8 gigs of RAM, is, well, the largest capacity module that's being produced right now is 512 MB, in other words, half a gig. And that's not really feasible for multiple reasons, one of them being price, the second one being just the size of it on the PCB, power, heat, various reasons. I'm not going to bother to go into all of them, but it just wouldn't really work to put that amount of them. After all, you'd need 16 of the blighters to give you the 8 gigs, right? Obviously, you get the idea with the maths, right? Now, as I've said previously, there are rumours of an 8GB PS4, and some people have even said maybe it could be 6. To be honest with you, I'd be shocked if this happened. I'd be pleasantly surprised, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's going to happen just realistically because of the same reasons I've mentioned with Durango. Now, so Durango has a lot more RAM, but slower RAM. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a worse approach. Now, bandwidth is very simple. Bandwidth is how much data you can shove down to the CPU, and obviously the more data you can throw into the CPU, the faster it can process it. It can become a choking point That's the best way to think of it. Think of it almost like, oh, I don't know, people trying to go down a corridor. Now, that end, room, you might be able to fit 50 people in there, but if the corridor can only fit one person at a time, single file, and albeit slowly, it's going to take a while for that room to fill up. It's just that simple. It doesn't matter what the previous room is in terms of size and what the other room is in size. If you've got to go down this narrow corridor, you can only go down at a certain speed. On the other hand, if you have a much wider corridor, you can, fit 2 or 3 people down, and they can maybe even run or something. Now, they can take a motorcycle if they really want to. That doesn't mean that Microsoft are stupid. That doesn't mean that they have no solution. There is a somewhat obvious one, and that's cache, or a similar principle anyway. It's got 32 megabytes of extremely fast memory, and this is attached to the graphics core. However, that does not mean it's exclusive to the graphics core. It can be accessed by the CPU too, and this means that if you combine the DDR3 with the DDR5 memory, you're going to be looking at 170 gigabytes per second. Bear in mind, however, that means you've got, extremely fast RAM of 32 megabytes and a lot slower RAM with, 8 gigs. Although what is accessible to systems, we'll talk about in a moment. Does that mean it's going to be tricky for developers? Does that mean that we're going to suddenly be like, oh god, what's happened to this Orbis port? Or sorry, what's happened to this Durango port? Or are we going to have really poor performances, or frame rate stuttering or whatever? Honestly, it's possible at this point. No one really knows. It's extremely early, and it's not even been confirmed, of course. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It's worth noting that not all of the stuff that makes a game work requires extremely fast RAM. So it's possible that 32 megabytes could be fine. It could be that it's a bit harder and trickier to program for. To be honest with you, I'm not that familiar with some of the intricacies of programming, so I don't want to comment too much on that. But it could be a bit trickier to really do. Obviously, there's always going to be some differences between the two consoles. That's just a given. So I know what you're going to yell. Well, okay, that doesn't really tell me what the better option is. To be honest with you, the better option would have been GDDR5 8 gigs. It's that simple. That's the best solution, okay? But a realistic solution is either of the two, and which one is going to prove to be better over time? Here's the thing. I can tell if a developer right now, let's say I had John Carmack sitting next to me, he could give me an idea. He could say, okay, this is probably better. But overall, in 3 to 4 to 5 years' time, we don't know what the engines are going to be like. We don't know how things are going to be developed. We don't know programming techniques to maybe get around limitations of either console. So with that said, it's very early to tell at the moment. So let's move on to something a bit different. Let's move on to the actual graphics. It's been rumoured for a while that the Xbox 720 has worse graphical capability than the Orbis. And is this true? Well, yes and no. I know it's a bit of a cop-out answer, and I'll go into this right now. Both systems are utilising Radeon cards, in other words from AMD, formerly ATI of course, they got bought out, and that's the GCN core. Now this core is known to be the heart and soul of the Radeon HD7XX graphics core. Now why do I say XXX? Well, it's very simple. The same core is utilised typically in many different graphics cards. There's differences in the amount of, say, textures or graphics, the core speed, and various other bits and bobs. That's generally what makes it, and how they usually do this is by binning. And for example, let's say they're making the higher grade core first, which is what they usually do, then the lower grade ones are, well, the ones that basically manufacture poorly. For example, pipes are missing or don't run at the speed they should. They'll create their brands accordingly. That's not always the case, but generally speaking. Now, it's very simple how graphics card rendering works. The idea is that you basically spread the load across many cores. Now the Xbox 360, Xbox 720 and PS4 are very different here, and indeed the Orbis has an 18 graphics cores, while the Xbox 720 only has 12. That's a 50% advantage to one of the consoles, and it's been, well, a war actually is the best way to look at it. For a while now, of just what consoles what. I mean, does that really mean that we're going to be seeing games 50% better looking on the Orbis? Surely that can't be true. Well, it's not exactly as black and white as it sounds. It's just like pretty much everything in technology, actually. Now, bear in mind, the information from the Xbox 720 Durango is around 9 months old now. So, in other words, from the ass end of last year. So does that mean that these specifications are wrong? Well, assuming the rumours themselves aren't completely fabricating, they are accurate rumours, then it's very unlikely actually that they're wrong. And I'll tell you why, very simply. It's the same reason that your console does not have... Sorry, when a console's released, it does not have the absolute best stuff in it. And it's very simple. The reason it doesn't have the latest stuff in it is because development cycles for consoles are quite a while. In other words, they can't just say, 3 or 4 months before launch, hey, you know what would be really cool if we did this, if we included this CPU, and everyone's like, oh, okay, cool. It takes a long time. One of the primary reasons for that, of course, is software programming, making sure that everything fits together, heat flow, power, a lot of stuff, really. So, what about the Orbis for a moment? Well, VG leaks have gone into some into depth of the Orbis' specifications, and there's a platform holder documentation which suggests that 4 of the compute cores are going... Sorry, 4 of these cores, these CUs, are reserved for compute functions. This could theoretically bring the PlayStation 4's advantage from 50%, which is pretty darn high, to 16%. I know what you're going to say. So what the bollocks is compute functions? What's that for? Okay, compute functions are actually used for some very cool shit, and apologies for the swearing, but it's pretty much there for physics. That's the main reason for it. Now, physics is notoriously draining actually on CPU tasks, and it's one of the primary reasons the physics in games are very, very difficult to keep pushing forward. When you're calculating things such as, say, cloth dynamics and fluids, fluid dynamics is a massive one. Fluid dynamics, believe it or not, can consist over many different things, not just water. It could be smoke, it could be blood particles, it could be the flow of various things, and even, as I've said before, I've used Ryu versus Ken. When you throw a fireball with Ryu, let's say Ryu throws that fireball, bits of dirt kicking up, that would all be physics. Now, NVIDIA have one of the better known physics in terms of hardware. They have what is known as PhysX. Now, their physics is utilizing CUDA for the most part, and they bought that from a small company. They bought the idea anyway. Now, that pretty much means that when you actually enable this physics, it looks amazing. I'm going to put out some more videos actually on this so you can get an idea actually. Suffice to say that if it's true, and the PlayStation 4 does reserve several of these cores for physics, it basically means that the system is going to be extremely good at handling physics. Now, the PlayStation 4, as I've mentioned previously, has a division, and it says no. These are reserved. You can use these if you want, bro. That's all you. If you don't need it, for example, let's say you're making an indie title, and that indie title doesn't need those physics cores. That's all you. You don't need to use them. You can use the CPU if you prefer, but those are reserved. Microsoft, however, have said, hey, you know what? It's not for us to say how you use our hardware. Microsoft has said you can use this however you want. So what it basically means is that the 12 of these cores can be used however the hell the developers want. Now, for those of you who are paying attention, there are 12 GCN cores on the Microsoft console. There are 18 of these things on, of course, have a console, the Orbis. This means that even if the Durango, or sorry, the developer does not choose to utilize these cores for CUDA, or sorry, for physics, and they choose not to do the same for the PlayStation, it's still going to have an advantage. If, on the other hand, they do decide that, hey, we need dedicated physics processing here, the CPU just ain't going to cut it, that's where your problems are going to start, because if they start taking away those cores, it could mean that, well, there's going to be an issue there. It could pretty much mean that the physics on the Durango console could be worse. Just if that's going to be true, whether this is actually reality, who knows right now. There is another point of contention from the Sony and Microsoft camps. Now, the Orbis has another distinct advantage. It has a large amount of ROPs. ROPs stand for Render Output Units. Now, there are 32 of them on the PS4, and the Durango has half of these. Now, very simply put, the more ROPs you have, it's easier to render higher resolutions. In other words, the higher resolution you can address. This also includes anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing capability, the capacity to render it. Anti-aliasing is extremely taxing on GPUs. That's why the older graphics cards in particular really fell over. They basically were like an asthmatic slug that was crawling through salt when it would come to AA. However, 16 of them, in other words the amount that Durango has, is more than enough to run at 1080p or even the higher 4K resolution. I'm sorry. 16 ROPs is enough to maintain 1080p. I misspoke there, I'm sorry. So why the hell does the PS4 have 32? It's actually kind of cool. The idea is for 1080p in stereoscopic or 4K resolution. That isn't to say that that's the principle. From what the rumours at the moment are circulating, it actually is that the Orbis is aimed at displays that are limited to 1080p. It's fairly safe to say, moving away a little bit from the graphics for a moment, that both systems have their own custom audio hardware, and it also appears they've got support for de-archiving of LZ compressed stuff. If you're not sure what LZ compression is, it's basically that, well, files tend to be compressed when they're stored. It's that simple. Think of this as support for compression, or should I say decompression of files on the fly. This can be extremely useful. The Durango does have a few interesting modifications by itself. It has what is known as a data move engines, which carry out hardware compression as well as decompression. They also support JPEG, and the only thing, well, people at the moment can assume this can be for the Kinect camera. Whether that's going to be true or not, who knows. They also support texture swapping. Now, the whole purpose of this is twofold. One, to reduce the burden on the CPU. It's not really there to improve graphics performance, but it's also there to reduce the taxing of the RAM, which, as I've mentioned previously, could well be a difficulty for the system. Now, the Xbox 360, of course, utilized DirectX 9. That's why quite a lot of ports for the PC are actually DX9. And they don't even have DX11 instruction sets, or if they do have the DX11 instruction sets, they're tacked on later. That's one of the reasons that occasionally PC ports can be a bit slower. Remember Batman Arkham City, anyone? I think we all do. This means that for developers of the Xbox 720 games, they're going to be using very familiar systems. They're going to be using DirectX 11, and they could access most of the console functionality using that. This is very different from Sony. Now obviously DX11 and DX itself is a proponent of Microsoft. Microsoft champion it, and Microsoft are happily going to be, using that and utilizing that. So Sony don't get a look in. Sony don't care too much, however. They're going to be using a libgcm library. Now, libgcm library has also been used in previous systems, the PS3 and the Vita, to name them, of course. This allows the developers to directly access the hardware itself. So, in other words, the developers can basically straight right to it. There's no need to worry about the front layer, in other words, DirectX itself. This means that you can actually do some pretty cool stuff. Now, one of the games that I think many people will remember would be God of War and Uncharted. I think there's one thing that I can say about those games, and I'm just remembering the footage playing back in my own head now. And I will say that even despite the fact that I'm a PC, enthusiast, I will have to admit those games do look pretty darn good. And there's a reason for that. Because of this method, they can do a lot of programming tricks, because they've basically got access, they've got root, think of it as root access. It's not exactly root access, I'm just saying, think of it as root access. They can do a lot of cool stuff, they can do a lot of cool tricks. This means that their hardware can blossom over time. This means that developers themselves, when they first saw the hardware, when they first saw the PS3 for example, they might have said, not sure about this. I don't really like the graphics core. I feel it's a little bit limited, perhaps. But as I've mentioned previously, or actually very early in this video, this allows you to basically create better programming techniques. So it could be a case that the PlayStation 4, despite already having a GPU bonus, if you will, over the Xbox 720, could actually have more of a bonus. It could actually have a further bonus because it's, simply put, more flexible. So there you have it. I think that just about covers everything. Now, both systems are going to be using Blu-ray. I don't think that's a surprise. I think we all knew that was happening. The discs are supposedly going to be 50 gigabytes, and that's once again not really a surprise. They're going to be 6-speed apparently. Once again, unsurprisingly, the Xbox 720 is going to be utilizing a hard drive as a standard. Thank God. I've mentioned before, I've been extraordinarily vocal on the Xbox 360's failure to include a hard drive as a standard feature, and I don't even know why they didn't do it. And to be honest, even the premium at the time, that is the time of the launch of the system, was really pitiful. I'm going to go on a bit of a rant here, but I don't understand why Microsoft made it 20 gigs. Even at the time, the hard drive was really expensive for the size. It's that simple. It was a complete rip-off, to be honest. And to be honest with you, I had to buy the core system because I wanted the system on the day. I could have waited, a couple of months, but I really want the system then, now, and now, because I was a tech head and I am a tech head. So I had to buy a core system with a memory card, which was 64 megabytes. I know, amazing, right? And then I had to buy a hard drive later on, and that pissed me off a little bit. But even when I was doing this, when I was buying it, I thought this is going to bite Microsoft in the butt. And that combined with the, failure to go with HD DVDs or the Blu-ray drives, of course, really did bite Microsoft in the butt, and perhaps even somewhat scuppered some of the next generation. How? Well, think about it this way: certain games such as Skyrim just have masses of data, and despite the fact that, of course, both systems were fairly memory limited, the fact of the matter is that you'd have to really heavily compress that disk because you can't split certain games over 2 disks. It's that simple. You might be able to do it for something like Grand Theft Auto, because, say, the cutscenes could be palmed off to a second disk, but you can't do that with Skyrim because you don't know where you can go. You can go from point A to point B to point C to point A again on the map if you're on a large quest, so it's just a bit difficult. On the other hand, if they had a hard drive as standard, let's say 120 gigs, they could have made it where the first disc was install, the second disc was play, or what have you. Anyway, I've completely gone off the tangent. This video's turned out to be extraordinarily long. I will be putting up an article, probably have to be tomorrow, about this, which is going to explain a lot of stuff as well. I'm going to put out another video, which is going to be explaining a lot about what physics is, and it's probably going to be showing a lot of it as well. And I'm going to be putting out another video, which will be going through a lot of the technical jargon on this, and that's going to be going through stuff like, you know, what is an audio processor, what is exactly a graphics card, what's its job, how does this work, what are texture units, what are CPU cores, what's the difference between this and that, and you get the idea by now. I'll be going into a lot of technical jargon, so it might give you guys a better understanding of this. So, anyway, I've talked your ear off. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will be now collapsing into a coma to relax for a few minutes and then edit. So take care of yourselves and bye for now.